what separates people who are good at being a CEO, a director, or whatever, makes very tangible P&L decisions is this ability to take advice and look into things, but also act, not drag it out too far, and then be able to deal with the consequences, whether good or bad.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision: should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Judit Petho, a former CEO at multiple organizations. Her experience is fascinating because she led companies at various levels of scale, from multinationals going through a complex merger down to scrappy startups where every decision counts. In our conversation today, we discuss what skills CEOs need at every level of size, and also why hard skills are not nearly as important as soft skills when it comes to being a chief executive. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, Judith. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How are you?
Thanks, Evgeny, for inviting me. I'm very well today, and I'm really looking forward to this. We have some interesting things to talk about.
Indeed, we'll have a very interesting conversation. But let's start with introducing you in more detail, because you had quite an unusual career. Can you just give an overview of what have you been up to professionally?
I started out as a professional, as a lawyer. I was working with really large companies, and I was doing tax structuring for them. And then I realized that we came up with all this fantastic advice, and then companies were doing something completely different. So I thought, I really want to understand strategy. I really want to understand what drives businesses. And frankly, I want to be there at the table. So very early on in my career, I wanted to be in the corner office, and I wanted to be at the table where decisions were made. I've never been shy about that. This has driven me, but it wasn't because I wanted titles. I wanted to understand, and I find companies endlessly fascinating. After I did an MBA, I went into a really large global organization called RSM, which is one of the largest in the world in consultancy and audit and so on. And I quite quickly progressed to global CEO role, which was really interesting, but it was also very corporate. But one of the things you don't really think about when you're in a big organization is how many things you take for granted. So I was doing this big role, very exciting. Then we lost our whole German coverage 1 year in like a few months. It just imploded. It was one of the largest businesses in Germany, but there was a founder dispute. The whole thing imploded. So I was kind of parachuted into Germany as a do something. We were doing global audits of big companies, and we could not have a German representation. And when you're doing global advisory to any kind of large business, you cannot just outsource that in a country. You have to be able to provide that. So I went into Germany, and I spent 3 months traveling around like crazy. I knew every airport and where to hire a car. Basically, I figured it out as I went along. I had no blueprint of how to establish one of the largest presences of a services company in a country where I haven't lived before. So I traveled around, and I talked to different people and brought them together. I tried to find commonalities, and didn't realize I was building skills that were very different from what you need in a big corporate. So I created RSM Germany like that, obviously with support from everywhere else, and I took up a leadership position. I brought together a 100 million euro revenue business from 11 different companies with their own cultures and ideas. Getting those businesses to follow the same quality control manuals, and that was the easy bit. What was really difficult is getting all these very senior people who were leading their own firms now wanting to be part of the same thing, being represented in a board with their own different ideas. And let's not forget that Germany is not one simple culture. Northern Germany is very different from the South, and unique, and the East is different from the West, and so on. So bringing all of these together to create one organization was a fantastic challenge, and it was also incredibly hard, right? And I do take pride in the fact that all these managing partners and managing directors from these businesses, no matter what they were saying, they all agreed on one thing, that they liked me leading the process. This was a moment where I realized two things in my career. One was that I really like dealing with people and I like helping them bridge their differences. And I really like building. And I also realized I was in a good but very stable organization. Something like this was a huge shock to the system, but I enjoyed it. I realized that I actually enjoy doing things that are hard. I like building, transforming. And as you say, I like bringing people together into the same room. So I decided that I'm feeling a bit itchy and I needed another project like that. So I went into a very large law firm as a CEO. So as I mentioned, I was a lawyer a long time ago. I haven't practiced in like 25 years. So I didn't go in as a lawyer. I went in as a business person, as a CEO, to help grow them, to help bring their different business units and their different offices together. Their offices were not really communicating with each other. And then I went in and it was kind of messy. And I had to do a turnaround. I realized certain things. One is that I took for granted a lot of things that are normal in a larger organization, but you don't have them in a mid-sized organization. And again, I realized that doing a complete turnaround is even harder than growth in many ways, because you're dealing with people and it ticks boxes if you want the challenge of working with people, but not necessarily many other things. And then after that, I got involved with the startup ecosystem, which was a really interesting transition. I took a CEO position in a legal tech startup, which was again going through some difficult times, and it needed to build up from basically the bottom. I learned a lot of things, which I will tell you. But one of the things I learned is that, all the things that I took for granted in a large organization, and then the things that I took for granted in a mid-sized organization that kind of was sticking along, I didn't have in the startup. There was nothing. I had to do everything. I had to figure it all out myself, which is what founders do anyway. If you start your own company, right? You have to do every single thing for yourself. These transitions challenged me on a hard skill level, on a soft skill level, on how I related to people, what I could do, what I enjoyed doing and what I didn't like doing. And I think one of the things that drove me was this eternal curiosity. And what now I've learned is kind of this beginner's mindset, which is the opposite of the fixed mindset. So that's why I can't sit still for too long. And I wouldn't be a good caretaker. And that's not a good or bad thing. You have to know yourself. What I realized as I did that job, there were lots of things I learned. For example, the importance of making sure your cap table is solid, because if you have a bad cap table, there's no way out of that situation. Basically, it doesn't matter what you do afterwards. A bad cap table will follow you around. That can be quite problematic. I also learned it's a fantastic feeling when you achieve certain milestones in a startup. It gives you more satisfaction and pride, I think, than any milestone in a corporate environment. Another thing I realized is that a lot of startups, as they grow, if started by people who haven't been on a journey like me, who haven't seen how a functional larger operation works, will find it very difficult or almost impossible to understand the importance of setting up processes, operations, accountabilities, and systems that can work without you, not just relying always on you. That can be really difficult if you've never seen that work. It can feel like someone's taking away your baby and your responsibility, and you want to hold on to that. So I think that while the fact that I went on this journey from larger to a startup helps me see things in a different way, that also helps with
Right.
growing something from smaller to larger and establishing all the practices that you need there.
Right. And I also imagine that it shows that you've got skills to operate at different levels of scale, because the skills required to operate at the startup level are different from what's required at a large company. And you learned how to navigate different company sizes, business challenges, and people challenges. You've got a very
That's
versatile
right.
skill set.
But I think that if you have a beginner's mindset and you're not afraid of learning and you're curious, then you can adapt. And adaptability is the most important thing. But if you have a fixed mindset, if you went for your career as that, okay, I don't know, professionals especially do that sometimes, that I work very hard for my qualification and this is the job I do. And I don't really want to learn new things all the time because I know how it's done. If that's your mindset, that fixed mindset, I think that's really detrimental. I'm not going to lie. I'm not an expert now in anything. I started out as an expert in things, but I think that happens when you go through a general management transition anyway. People who are in general management roles lose that sort of expertise because that's not what's needed to be really good at managing something. To be a founder, you don't need to be an expert in one thing. You need to connect dots and attack problems, basically. Right?
Yes, but being able to connect the dots and be a general manager of a complex process is a skill in itself. It might not be a narrow
That's right.
vertical skill, but
That's right.
it does take expertise to be a
That's
general
right.
manager of really anything.
But, and again, that's something where the curiosity and the beginner's mindset is incredibly helpful, because one thing you have to learn when you become a general manager or when you're a founder of a startup, when you're a CEO of any kind of business, you have to learn that two things, I think. One is that you don't know everything. And there are people who are better at this, and that's okay. And you shouldn't feel threatened by that. I think a lot of people in general management role are threatened by people who are very good at certain technical aspects. And so you shouldn't be afraid of bringing people in who are really good at what they do at that level. And the other thing is being confident in your ability to see through issues and solve problems. This is a skill that doesn't come naturally. You have to develop it if it never happened to you, especially if you come from, as I say, some sort of technical background, that you have to have a confidence that you're still important and what you're doing is still very, very important, even if you're not technically very good at it. Let me give you an example. I've worked a lot with recently with a very senior CEO who's went through his own development stages. And his original expertise was in marketing. And then he was in corporate roles and he built a company from almost nothing to something quite big. And he said the most difficult role to hire for is a marketing director. And he knows that he hasn't been doing marketing as a job for a long time now. He has been a CEO for a long time. But there's still that little itch where he feels like he knows it better, or he should know it better. Even though he knows he doesn't know it better. It's still a kind of thing of letting it go and accepting that maybe I shouldn't try to influence this person. I need to let that person get on with the job without influencing them too much. And it was 2-3 years ago, I was talking to a venture builder, and I was talking to this person in the healthcare industry, health tech industry, who again had a marketing background. And we were talking about this business and how this is going and what needed to be done. At one point he said, well, clearly you understand how the marketing of this needs to be done and the sales. I mean, you understand that. That's not an issue. Let's talk about this bit. And I thought, I've never been a marketing director. I've never been a marketing manager. But what I've done is I've been in a very small business that I had to build from nothing. And I had to work incredibly closely with a junior marketing manager of figuring out what we can do. So you learn on the job, which should be very familiar for founders. But I think it's important to recognize that you learn things and you can dabble with things, but you're not an expert.
Yeah. So, Judith, Can you tell me about your experience of coming in as a senior leader at three different levels? Because first, you started working with this German company, navigating a very complex situation in Germany. Then you went to the law firm as the CEO, trying to do a turnaround. And finally, there was you leading a small startup. So, same job title, three very different situations. What were similarities and differences? What was your experience of stepping into the senior leadership role at different levels of scale of the company?
I think the first thing to say is you're exactly right. These had the same title, they were completely different jobs. So when someone says they are a CEO, it doesn't matter what sort of business they are a CEO of. It's just completely different. There are some things you have to understand in all of them, though. As a CEO, you need to have some understanding of business and finance, basic things at least. You have to understand where your resources are coming from, both financial, other hard resources, and also the people. It doesn't matter which size business you're at, you have to understand that. In a large business, you have to do a lot more strategy, if you like, and discussing it with senior leaders, convincing them and coming together for to create a certain strategy that then gets, it's more formalized and that it gets executed. You need to understand resources and the competitive landscape. And that's the same in a mid-sized company. And you have to understand what are the things you have and you can work with and turn into something else. What are the things that need to be cut out or don't help you achieve any goals? In a small startup, you're always resource constrained, no matter what. You're always going to be resource constrained. There's always going to be a lot more that you need than what you already have. You have to pay attention to the resources that you manage. And then the other aspect of it is the people management bit. So you're doing a completely different jobs, but you still have to get people around you to do what you need them to do. It's just in a startup, that includes your team. And if it's a good, strong little team that you build up, then getting them on the same page is probably easier. But then you still have your customers and you have your different type of investors. I think in a startup, that's the hardest thing, managing your investors, especially if they are a different bunch, or if you end up in a situation like I was, where I wasn't actually the one who picked the investors, I kind of inherited a lot of them. And I had to convince them to keep investing while doing the day job. When you're in a turnaround situation, again, you have to get people on board with what you're doing so that nobody sabotages the effort. Because in a turnaround situation, that often happens. So there are these common threads, which are again about skills and about attitude. I think that's another thing. Attitude is really important. But there's huge differences. You have to operate at very, very different levels, and you're involved with very, very different things. When I was in a large organization, I never really saw a detailed cash flow because there was no need, because there were very senior finance people that are doing that. And then I saw the end result when we decided that this is the marketing, this is whatever we needed to do. Again, you have directors who are already doing that. And when you're in a mid-sized company, that's already quite different. I see more and more the COO position becoming a thing in the UK. It's still sometimes misunderstood. I was a global COO. That's part of my background, and I enjoy dealing with operations. But when you're in a mid-sized company, especially one that doesn't have a very complex structure, it doesn't even matter what the size. If it doesn't have a complex structure, having a CEO is not a waste, obviously, but you can't afford to do it. You can't afford to have a serious CEO, because sometimes the CEO and CEO positions need to be one. Otherwise, you'd all both do kind of half jobs. It's not necessarily the case, but it quite often is, actually, especially if you're maintaining a business as opposed to building it.
Yeah.
So again,
Judith, how do you think about the role of the COO? Because quite often, in my experience, it really depends on the skill set of the CEO. And so the two roles really need to be thought through at the same time together. They're so complementary and working closely together. And I'm curious, How do you think about the role of the COO, their responsibilities, and the relationship with the CEO?
I think you are absolutely spot on in that it needs to fit with the skill set of the CEO, but it also needs to fit with the structure of the business. If you have a complex organization with many departments, the CEO will end up doing quite a lot of coordination between the departments. And because you need to bring people on the same page, you're doing a lot of execution. The simplistic way of looking at it is that you want the CEO to be thinking of the big picture and the external connections and the strategy and the growth, acquiring new targets and doing all that. And then the COO is doing the groundwork. But that's not always the case. The important thing is there always needs to be enough flexibility so that the roles play to the strength of people. So if you have a big picture CEO and you have a more detailed oriented COO, that's good. But they can work in a slightly roundabout way as well, where the COO is quite strategic too, and the kind of the work between them gets split again according to their own strength. Everybody, nobody wakes up, or walks out of university as a CEO. You don't. There's a bunch of skills you have to develop to get there. And it's the same for a COO. And in many places, a COO is the CEO in waiting, someone who can always step in and take over everything else, someone who has a similar kind of oversight of things. I often get asked, and it often comes up, how do people become CEOs in general? What makes a good CEO? What does the CEO do? And what does a CEO do? That depends on the business and on you. Most CEOs have come through, whether internal or external, they've come through a lot of different phases in their career, and they've been exposed to different departments. It's not like, okay, you get into finance and you go up and then you're going to be a CEO, or you get into marketing and the best CEOs move laterally quite a lot. So because you want to develop skills, you want to understand things from different angles. And that's helpful both for CEOs and for COOs as well. So I don't have a fixed answer to your question about what a COO looks like, but I think it very much depends on the complexity of the business. Now, I've seen a lot recently when founders who wanted more structure in their business, but didn't want to step down as a CEO, bringing in an experienced operator and giving them the COO title, right? That happens quite a lot. And I don't know if that really works well. I don't think it necessarily does unless it's kind of a transitional thing. Because bringing in a COO, if you're a founder and you've never run anything bigger than where you are right now, and you're not paying a lot of attention to developing the skills of a CEO, then there's going to be clashes between an experienced COO and the CEO. There will be, because they're bringing in a different type of knowledge, right? So a COO is not an operations director. They have a much wider view of everything that is happening in the business. In fact, the COO position is a really good way of getting a really good understanding of how a business operates and what the different bits do and how to pull different levers in the organization to get things done. And that also helps with developing general management skills and strategic skills and eventually in a CEO position.
So what I'm hearing is that different people arrive at CEO and COO jobs in very different ways. Every journey is unique, but what seems to be shared across all of them is a breadth of experience, being exposed to different parts of the business, having diverse professional experience, and a deep understanding of running the business as the result.
Whatever title you have at a C-level position, you need that deep understanding of the business and what's under the hood. I've been parachuted in. Some people come up from the ground up, like the General Motors CEO, Barry Barra, who came through the ranks, but she also moved around. She was even in an HR position at one point, I think. I think when we are young, we always think the CEO is the position, that's the corner office, the person who calls the shot, and I'm just sitting in there and I'm the cleverest and I tell everybody what to do and I know it's way better than anybody else anyway. Right? That's kind of how we imagine a CEO. And then
Yeah,
the
and
more
it's
you
not
do
like
it, the
this
more
at
you
all.
realize that it's exactly opposite of all of that. Like, and when it comes to calling the shots, you bear all the responsibility. It's all on your shoulder. Yeah, especially when you're running a startup and you look at your cash flow statement. I mean, talk about culture shock. When you get to the startup level, the daily cash flow management you have to do. And if you come from a bigger company, you're seeing it's not enough that I have to, change the light bulb myself, but I have to go through the cash flow statements every single day or every week or whatever. Because otherwise I can't pay my people.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yep.
it's
You've got to understand
crushing.
every expense.
You have to understand every single thing that's happening in the business. But also, I think the bigger the business is, and bigger I mean already when you're a few million revenue and you're doing more than one thing, you have more than one product. You also have to understand the relationship between them. You have to understand, the profitability of it. And now I dare talk about profitability in the startup context as well. A few years ago, I couldn't. But you see, because I come from that whole management and operations background as well, I've always been very big on unit economics. And I want to understand the profitability of every single thing, which doesn't mean that you only focus on the most profitable things, because sometimes you also need the one that, and this is where experience comes in, right? Nobody teaches you this in school, and I've done MBA. Nobody teaches you this. You have to figure it out, that when you have to think about the business model, right? And you can't be too reliant on one type of customer or one type of product, because those can pull. If you have only one big customer, let's say you're running a software business, you have only one customer, that's super risky. So you might need to diversify into other bits as well. Like, I always love a business that has kind of a very boring service or product that sells well and generates profit. It doesn't have to be high, but it's quite reliable. It's kind of always there. And then you have some more superstar service or superstar product where you can generate high profit, but maybe the demand is going to be like this. So you kind of, if you have the two separately, then the boring product with not high profitability is going to be an incredibly boring business to run. But if you have the very profitable but really volatile one, that's going to be a very risky one where you are always checking cash flows and you're going to have people sitting around not doing anything at times. So you have to kind of marry the two and diversify into whatever you can. But then you have to do that in a way that you also focus on certain things and you don't spread yourself too thin, which is in a startup is another thing. You have that flexibility in a startup, which I really love, that you can do all sorts of things. Then you can pivot to other things. And when there's a big change, you can adjust to it quite quickly, which, like, if you're in a big company, that's like trying to move a tanker. It takes forever. It's really hard because you have things set up in a certain way. In a startup, you can be spread too thin or you have too many inputs, or you can have one board member or an investor or somebody, oh, I thought these people are doing that, you should do that too. And they're like, well, yeah.
Yes, but that's our job as CEOs to push back.
Exactly, but that's not what I want to do. You don't want to dampen everybody's excitement when they're like, oh, maybe we could do that too. And that's an exciting service. I talk to startups sometimes. I've been talking to a health tech startup recently. I really like them. They're great. But I didn't speak to them for a month and they came back, wow, we're also going to be doing this, which technically fits with what they're doing, but actually it's in a completely different, it serves a completely different sector and different issues. I'm like, guys, you're so early stage, you can't do all of that. at the same time. But the temptation is always there. So you have to learn to focus while also staying very flexible. And one of the things that I'm kind of very evangelical about is that somewhat larger companies can do that too. Like not the really big ones, but some medium-sized and other growing companies should be much more agile and shouldn't be burdening themselves down with processes and bureaucracy all the time. Which is again a risk when you're building a startup up. You reach a certain stage, you want to set up processes and you want to be very professional, but also you don't want to go overboard. So this is the skill. This is what makes good general managers and CEOs, knowing when to do what. And it's all about judgment. And that's why you need experience.
And it comes with experience.
Exactly. That's why, investors like repeat founders or senior people who've been in different places as well, because it's not a science. Yes, you want everything backed up by data and you want to do some analysis, but at the end of the day, you just have to make a call. Any decision will have drawbacks. Nothing is going to be clear cut. And I think, I always think about the fact that we like to, in the startup, we like to talk about, lessons learned and all of that. And sometimes the only lesson you learn is that I made the best decision I thought was right at the time with what I had, and then it didn't work out that way. But sometimes there are serious lessons to be learned, and sometimes there just isn't, because if there was only one way to do it or just one decision to be made, then anyone could do it. And I think this is again what separates people who are good at being a CEO, a director, or whatever, makes very tangible P&L decisions, is this ability to take advice and look into things, but also act, not drag it out too far, and then be able to deal with the consequences, whether good or bad. To sit down and analyze and say, okay, this is for that. Take responsibility, welcome the accountability. A very senior CEO I've been talking to mentioned that, and I think he's right, that what makes really good managers is this ability to welcome accountability, to not want to run away from it, because that's when you kind of learn that, we made this decision because of this, and that was right, or maybe this process doesn't work. So you have to go through that process without being scared of it. If you're scared that you're making mistakes, then you're never gonna progress beyond a certain level. You can't be scared of making mistakes. You will make, everybody makes mistakes, and nothing is ever clear cut. The question is, I think once you're really big and you have an established brand, then you can make mistakes that will damage the brand, and that's a problem. You see that sometimes with bigger organizations, like with Starbucks or Sonos or whatever, where there have been recent CEO departures because decisions they made actually damaged the brand. So that's the tricky bit. Having said that, I'm not there. I haven't been there, so I don't know if they actually made the right decision or the wrong decision. Sometimes you take risks as a CEO and it pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. So again, I come from a culture, and I come from professions where making a mistake is like, you can't do that. It's not done. Like, life is over if you made a little mistake. And as a CEO, as a founder, as a general manager, as a director, you have to learn to say now, okay, as long as no one died and as long as the business is still there, tomorrow is another day, and we'll sort it out. I've made the best decision I could possibly make. I think that's the important thing. Whatever decision I make, I've had to make some incredibly hard decisions in my career. And that's what I learned, that the only way to do that is, you can't put it off. Sometimes you have to make it. Sometimes the decision has to be made in like minutes. You just have no choice. And the only way to be able to cope with that is to know that, okay, I've done everything I could to the best of my ability. And certain things just happen the way they happen. And you go on, and then you correct as you can. Exactly. So there's a bit of an experience and art to all of this.
Yeah. And Judith, let's shift the conversation towards soft skills versus hard skills. I followed you on Substack for a while. I know you've got a few strong opinions in this area. Can you tell me about the role that soft skills played in your career and especially in your leadership positions at both big companies and small startups?
It's, you know, because I kind of came from this very technical background, because, legal and tax and all of that, and finance and accounting, all of that is very technical. I grew up career-wise at the beginning, especially thinking that the most important thing is technical knowledge, and you have to know the hard skill, and you have to you have to be able to read the balance sheet, and you have to understand how things add up. But when I look back on my career and what helped me progress, very fast at times, incredibly fast, to incredibly high responsibility positions. And a lot of that had to do with soft skills. I realized it wasn't about me being the most clever person in the room. It was about relating to people. It was about listening to them. And it was about adjusting my own style of working and communications to the organization I was a part of. And because I've been in different organizations, I have a very good understanding of how that works. And that's all soft skills, that the ability to understand what's going on around you, the ability to listen to what people are actually telling you, and then make that judgment call about what's important to listen to and what isn't really important to listen to. All of that is this intangible thing. And I really hated that we call it soft skill. And I don't have a better word for it, but it's a very annoying thing, because when we say soft skill, people immediately imagine being touchy-feely, kind of feminine, or this emotive talk. It's not about that at all. It's about getting people to do what you need them to do, getting them to understand what needs to be done. So, this sort of idea that a leader or someone who's successful just goes into a room and just barks commands and everybody does it and there's going to be success. It's not just outdated, it's dangerous. That's just not how life works. And the more complex an organization you're in, the more you have to understand. Every organization has a rhythm, has a heartbeat, has a way of doing things. We talk a lot about organizational cultures, which are basically based on values, but that's really people's behavior. And you have to be able to use them. Soft skills that help you execute quite a lot of things. Because you have to recognize and understand the informal networks of influence that help a business grow. I think it was in a Chicago Business School executive course where I first heard about this idea. It was quite early in my executive career that there are these informal networks of people, and they're very helpful. And I kind of incorporated that into my way of working, that you have to understand who are the people with the biggest influence within an organization to get things done. Like, I work a lot in change and transformation, and a lot of change and transformation projects kind of fail because people dictate, as opposed to going down and talk to the medium level of management as well, so that and talk to the shop floor, for example, understanding what's happening there. These things are significantly more important. It's because all the hard skills that can be farmed out to somebody else. You can get someone else to do the cash flow analysis and whatever. But these soft skills, the relationship, building up that kind of relationship capital as well, understanding what the true problems are. People, especially if you're the boss, and it doesn't matter what size organization you are. If you're the boss, you're not going to hear the actual truth. I think that's critical, and that has been super important, I think, in my career, and anything that, looking back now, anything that I managed to do well, kind of all went back to this ability to relate to other people and get things done that way. To say the hard skills are very easy, actually. They are the easy bit. It's soft skills that are really hard to develop.
Yeah. It sounds like what you're describing is the light side of soft skills. Building informal networks, understanding people, influence them. But the other side of the same thing is what I think people commonly refer to as corporate politics. Getting stuff done, not through official channels and procedures, but figuring out how to influence people in roundabout way, and it's it does have some side effects. How do you see the connection between these two things? When is it
I love,
using soft skills to be really great at your job, and when is it just corporate politics, which no one loves?
I love that question. It's one of my favorite areas. I think we need to differentiate between politics and politicking, and gossiping and politicking. That's what you want to root out. You don't want that in your organization. And your culture is about values and behaviors you tolerate in a business. It's not the nice, statements we make. It's about what you tolerate in a business. And this sort of, nasty attacking each other things, and department heads and so on amongst each other, or trying to say bad things about it, happens all the time, and that needs to be rooted out. You cannot allow that to proliferate the organization. You can't have that. But but in general, politics is something that has to happen all the time, everywhere, wherever you have people. But it's how it's done, and what you're trying to achieve with it, that is really, really important. So it's not the gossiping. It's more about just making sure, like, there are some people who are really good at making kind of friends and connections in other departments. I saw a conversation somewhere, and not too long ago, where people were complaining that if you have that some CEOs don't like to have one-on-one meetings with people who report to them. They just want to have one big conversation with, like, 60 people or whatever, and because anything can be said in that forum. And I don't agree with that. I think sometimes you do need those one-on-one meetings to also help people develop their own skills, and some things are just better because everybody is so different, and I mean, I like to tailor my communication to the people I'm dealing with. But somebody was complaining that they didn't like to do the one-on-ones because it always ended up with the kind of discussions that you were describing, this kind of undermining other people, gossiping about other people, attacking other people behind their back. And as a CEO, I'm afraid you have to put a stop to that. And if you allow that to keep going, then it's going to keep going. If you allow people to come into your room and do that, that that's not going to be good. So you can still have the one-on-ones, but you can also make it clear that, guys, we don't do this in this organization. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
I'm interested in facts, and I'm interested in people working together. And if we have personal problems, and I have had to deal with that, where I had very senior people at each other's throat because they just had a personal, they just did not like each other. And there are techniques and things you can do, and you have coaches and mentors who can help you with that to sort that out. But you cannot let it fester. And or people have the right not to like each other. It's perfectly fine. But if their bad relationship is detrimental to the company, then something drastic has to be done, because you cannot allow it to stand, essentially. So I think politics is fine if all it is using, or making sure that resources are being used the right way, and making sure that things are done. It happens all the time when you have a certain size of an organization, that you're going to have, I don't know, IT complaining that nobody takes seriously what they are saying, or sales complaining that finance department doesn't allow them to spend on whatever dinners or whatever they need to do to get things done. So those are normal tensions in an organization that have to be worked through and worked out. And you do want people who are good at having those conversations and making sure that people can work together. And that, again, that's soft skill. And I would say that the most important soft skill is listening.
Right.
As a CEO, you actually have to just spend a lot of time listening. And listening means not trying to formulate a response. It doesn't mean sitting there and letting people talk and then you walk away. Listening means actually kind of processing what they're saying and deciding what warrants a response from you, what doesn't, what is relevant feedback, what isn't relevant feedback. And it also helps to kind of reassure people as well that, okay, we're not going to do this, but it's going to be fine. So the soft skill again is also about not immediately dismissing someone when they come to you with something, even if you know it's actually quite silly and you shouldn't be talking about this, then it doesn't matter. But if it should be part of a leadership skill set to be able to say, to be able to manage that and quickly. And if people walk away from a conversation with you feeling like, well, okay, I didn't get everything that I wanted, but it's fine, then you've done well. And I always go back to Tom Peters, who's legendary in Search of Excellence. He's a legendary leadership and other thinker and doer and consultant. And he's retired now pretty much. But a few years ago, he did that several times on what was then Twitter. He sent out this little message. Okay, people, what do you think is more important in the world? What do we need more of? Do we need more IQ or do we need more EQ? And he used to get really angry because people would write that we need more IQ, we need more knowledge, we need more this. And he'd be like, no, people know we have more than enough of that. What we don't have is people actually understanding each other. Right. Yes, that's what's missing. And that's when he started writing this thing, which I like to quote this: hard is soft and soft is hard, which is essentially about the hard skills are actually really kind of easy. Understanding the fact, I mean, don't get me wrong, you have to learn that. It's not that easy. It doesn't just happen. You have to learn
Relatively
it.
easy.
Exactly, but you can learn it kind of from a book. Let's make that distinction. The hard skills you can kind of learn from a book or something. The soft skills you can't. To develop the soft skills, which are really difficult to get right because it involves individual people. You have to be out there and you have to be communicating and you have to be exposed to different things. So if someone tells me that they've been, I don't know, running this team for 15 years and they have really good soft skills and their team is very happy, I'd say, well, let's put you in another team and let's see how that works.
Judith, I completely agree that soft skills are super important here, but we usually develop soft skills when we interact with real people in the real world. And in the last 5 years, since the pandemic, a lot of people started working online remotely. And I'm really curious, in your opinion, in your experience, what difference does it make, if any, in terms of how we develop or use soft skills in our work?
I love that question. That's a great question. And one that is really hard to answer because I think there's those of us who have worked before and we develop skills and we know how to behave in a meeting and we know to get out of a meeting. We know how to, build rapport and relationship with people. And if you already know how to do that, then doing it over Zoom or whatever, I don't think it makes a lot of difference. I mean, to be honest with you, as I personally don't like phone calls so much because I like to see people's reaction. Yeah. I recently wrote about, the importance of being able to read the room. I had one of my subscribers who used to be actually my coach some years ago. He picked up on that one and he said that really spoke to him, that the importance of that, of understanding what is happening around you. So being able to read cues in the other person, whether that's their body language or, you don't have to overly rely on it, but you do need to see. So I find that with my communications, whether I'm recruiting someone, I'm negotiating anything at any level, or I'm giving feedback, I'm getting feedback. Whatever I do, I like to do face to face because there's a kind of connection you can build that way, and I don't find it that difficult to do on a video call, but I do find it difficult on just a phone call. And I'm sure that's different for different people. I'm very visual. I do like to see what's happening around me, but it does help when you're in the same room with someone. I agree in some things. So my views have been for a long time now that hybrid work is the right way of doing it. So when there's something very important, very critical, then you do want to get together physically in the same room. This whole thing when you're negotiating, you do need to be able to look people in the eyes sometimes, and read the connection and their interactions, or whatnot. I was just thinking that there was a meeting yesterday between President Trump of the U.S. and President Macron from France, and that was a super interesting conversation. And the fact that President Macron felt the need to go directly to the U.S. to have that conversation next to each other and have that physical thing where he even put his hand on President Trump's hand. So sometimes you do need that. But there are a lot of things that you can do separately. And actually, I have built up interesting, very good working relationships with people over Zoom as well recently, and also relationships that already exist are easy to maintain this way. Having said all that, if you're very new to working, so for all of those people who started their careers, just before COVID, during COVID, I really feel for them, because I can imagine that building these soft skills up from just video calls must be super difficult. Having said that, and I do understand a lot of people suffer from video fatigue and so on, I do find that quite helpful. I do think that it's, I'm from the age where we used to have conference calls all the time, with the spider phone in the middle of the desk and everybody dialing in and we're talking that way. We used to do that as well, and it was, we could do business that way. We ran international committees that way. We had somebody in Australia. At one point, I was sitting in Miami. Somebody was dialing in from London. Someone else from wherever else. And we still did the meetings, and there were funny things in there because everybody was speaking English, but with very different accents. And at one point, I had to step in that, you know what, guys, we're not going to argue about how we're writing it. I speak international English, and that's how we're going to write it. It's going to be, and everybody was laughing that, okay, fine, we can do it that way. So we still managed to do business that way. But I do think that, those who are starting their careers definitely can gain a lot from observing people in real life, in an office environment. But that doesn't have to be all the time. So I'm still a big believer in hybrid work. But, bringing younger people to meetings with us is very important so that they learn by osmosis how people behave. I think there's certain meeting etiquettes and so on that kind of can fall through the cracks otherwise if we don't do that. So I don't think we should lose that. But I think that, maybe because I worked international jobs for so long and I had to do business internationally for so long that you just have to know when you have to have a face-to-face meeting and when and most of the time critical. Actually you're perfectly fine using other mediums. And some people are really good on emails or messages, for example. You can actually build up a close working relationships with people like that. But in an international organization, we used to bring everybody together once a year at a big conference. And that was enough to build up enough of a connection that the rest of the times you could rely on that. And you could make that phone call to someone just because you spent a couple of days together. And that's enough of a connection to that you can keep it going over phone, over video call, over emails, and so on. Because the whole idea is really to build up this kind of, giving people the benefit of the doubt. That's what I think really what it's all about. So that there is no adversarial kind of thing. So we don't go and get into a conversation about, oh, this person is so stupid and I don't like them and they want bad things. Right. So when you get people in the room together, that helps build up that trust.
Yes.
It is the bad
Yeah.
trust to a large extent. And for that, sometimes
Yeah.
it's good to do. But I'm very flexible. I think you can do all sorts of things in all different mediums as well. So, but yeah, I do feel for those who are just starting their careers. They definitely have to make an effort to get as much face time with people as they possibly can to help develop these skills.
Yeah,
I think
it's a different world. And Judith, as we are preparing to start wrapping up our conversation today, is there anything else that you would like to add or share with the listeners?
I think one of the most important things, it doesn't matter what kind of organization you run. It doesn't matter if you're moving in a career direction like I did from bigger company to a smaller one and going through those shocks, realizing that there is no marketing department to do things for you, or you're building a startup from something quite small to something much bigger. The most important thing is to learn who you are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what you like doing and what you don't like doing. And I was having this conversation actually with this old coach of mine the other day, that I used to have this very strong feeling because of the way my career developed, that you can throw me into any situation and I will deal with it. I will figure it out, and I can go into very toxic places as well, and I will figure it out. And lately I've been thinking that, yeah, I will figure it out, but do I want to? Is that the best use of my time for me or for anybody else? So knowing what you can do and what you want to do, what you're good at, what you want to develop, what you don't want to develop, these are incredibly important, because you can't do everything by yourself, and you have to build teams around you, no matter what organization you are. And especially if you're building from a small business as a founder, you're building up something big. You're gonna be going through all these learning curves where you can keep up to some extent to whatever stage, but there will come point in time when you will feel that you don't want to learn anymore about doing something in a completely different way. You need to also be able to tell that this is where I'm happiest. This is what I like doing most, and whatever stage that is. And being very honest with yourself about that. And the only way to do that is really to, have coaches and mentors and talk to peers, but self-reflect. No one can tell you that. You're the only person who can tell that. And then not hold on to things that you shouldn't hold on to anymore because you feel that, you're going to lose status or whatever. Sometimes you have to let go so that you can go on to a next phase of development or a next adventure or whatever it is. So I think that sort of self-reflection, understanding, being both confident and forgiving with yourself, but also being very honest. That will help you build the right teams around you. That will help you know when it's time to move on from something, or when it's time to keep, doubling down on learning new skills. All of that is I think, really the basis of going through this fantastic journey of our careers and lives and building things.
Yeah, I completely agree. As someone said, you can't Google self-knowledge.
Absolutely
Judith,
right.
thank you so much for this conversation. I hope it's going to be interesting and useful to our listeners, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great fun. Thanks.
To wrap up our conversation, I would like to highlight a couple of points. The first one is the importance of soft skills, and especially listening skills. As Judith explained, it's not enough to know the hard skills, the basics of finance, accounting, product, technology, and so on. A leader, especially a CEO, needs to have soft skills, needs to know how to understand people, how to build relationships with them, how to communicate effectively, and above all, how to listen well. And the other point that Judith made related to the importance of the beginner's mindset, of being really open and humble, remembering that no one knows everything. And this especially applies to CEOs who are in the leadership position, carrying the ultimate responsibility for the business. And yet they are surrounded by experts who know each area of the business far better than they do. And so remembering that they don't know everything and it's okay and they can figure it out if necessary can be incredibly liberating. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and speak to you soon.